We talk about that still, small voice within. But what about that other voice? The one that tells us that we know what's right for someone standing before us, sad and distressed, and that it is in fact our job to tell people what to do. That tells us if people don't listen to our advice, they'd be better off. And that tells us that others are just ignorant, and they just clearly haven't thought things through. That voice. We talk about our righteous indignation. And yet, what about our self-righteous indignation, which says that it's wrong when others demean and hurt, and so somehow that justifies our demeaning and hurting others? We talk about our sense of compassion, and yet, what about our sense of condemnation, which judges the choices of our coworkers or our neighbors or our fellow citizens, which says that NPR is clearly better than talk radio, or opera is better than auto racing, or that formal education is clearly a better sense and source of wisdom than the kind that comes from a life lived hard and well? What about that? What about those voices? You know, I'm just asking for a friend. Now, I know that I have some times when I could be a lot more humble. Maybe I'm the only one here in this sanctuary today with that issue. Or maybe not, maybe not. So I invite you, when we're in this space with one another, where we try to consider the ways in which we want to live in the world and the world in which we want to live, what triggers your arrogant persona? And also, what humbles you? Those pictures that we saw just a little while ago humbled me. Illness can humble us, ours or the illness of someone that we love so dearly. The morphing of our democracy and the changes in our planet could humble us as well. Economic instability could humble us. The cacophony of Me Too voices all around us at the end of the year could humble us. Earthquakes, fires, mudslides. Trying to maintain relationships when others don't think exactly as we do could, in fact, humble us. Witnessing others' pain, as our delegation to the border did, could humble us. The particulars and the panorama of the natural world could humble us in a good way, and so could the loyalty and faithfulness of love that we encounter at certain times in our life. It could be humbling. There are many, many opportunities, and yet how many of us maintain that attitude that we see sometimes in our toddlers who say, "Me do it. Just me. Me alone." It is hard for us, I believe, to realize that sometimes we end up succumbing to our despair because we can't decouple our desire to help from a need to solve and fix, whether it's personal or societal problems. And you know, among us, those of us gathered in this sanctuary, those of us in liberal religion in general, humility as a virtue just has sort of a bad rap. Frederick Buechner, the Christian theologian, put it this way: humility is often confused with saying that you're not much of a bridge player when you know perfectly well that you are. Conscious or otherwise, this kind of humility is a form of gamesmanship. If you really aren't much of a bridge player, he says, you're apt to be rather proud of yourself for the humility of admitting it that way. This kind of humility is a form of low comedy, he says. Actually, as I thought about preparing for this sermon on this topic, I realized that false humility may actually be the kind that is most readily accepted among us, which is interesting to think about. It's the only kind that we really feel comfortable with, but even that, I think, makes us feel just a little bit squeamish, just a little bit like eating the cold pizza that you know has been sitting out since the night before, It tastes kind of good, but then you're not sure it won't give you food poisoning, right? So let's face it. Humility or any virtues among us sometimes lose our ratings war. They're down in the popular opinion polling. They're rejected like the idea of the hair shirt, or confused. Humility is for its evil twin, humiliation, which most of us have known and no one is going to willingly invite back into their life for good reasons. I will point out to you that humility is not a word listed in the subject index in our hymnal for either readings or hymns that are commonly used among us. Think about that. It is not something that we actively try to garner, and it's hard for us to separate it from the idea that if we are humble, we will be controlled by others. We associate humility with those who are just, a little less smart maybe than we are, a little less accomplished, a little less together. If you Google movies about humility, which I did recently, Forrest Gump is one of the top 3 listed in every search engine. So I want to look, as I spent some time looking at this relationship between humility and organized religion. And when I started looking into it, I started to realize why it has such an interesting relationship for us. Because in some branches of some faiths, humility is a code for making oneself as powerless and passive as possible against the much greater will of an almighty who manifests themselves through the authority of an all-knowing church with all-powerful leaders. That is one way in which it is used in a religious context, but it is not the only way. And having rejected that kind of humility, I think for us, out goes the baby with the bathwater, right? It's like we think we are too smart to need humility, which shows, well, I have to tell you, a lack of humility. Frederick Buechner says this: true humility does not consist of thinking ill of yourself, but of not thinking of yourself much differently from the way you'd be apt to think of anybody else. It is the capacity for being no more or no less pleased when you play your own hand well, as when your opponents do. We think we can find a workaround with not having to be humble. We think we should be able to devise a plan for anything. Humility means accepting reality with no attempt to outsmart it, says author David Rico, who will be visiting with us in February. Accepting reality with no attempt to outsmart it. Sometimes that is not the way among us. Now, hubris. Hubris is something we can talk about. You can get a really good conversation going in our social hall or at one of our gatherings by just talking about somebody else's hubris, preferably somebody outside of our community. Hence the need to get back to humility. But hubris, I think, is a good foil for us to think about our lost connection with humility. Hubris says, let me tell you what to do, when someone comes looking to us just for a listening ear. It says it's ours to fix everything, even for people who have not asked to be fixed. Humility, in some off way, is part of recognizing our interdependence and that we will not be perfect and that we are, in fact, not. This is a big surprise to us, all-knowing. Hubris makes the bad events in the world ours to solve, all of them. It means we need to look away from things that are too hard for us to completely comprehend or hold because it's too overwhelming and because, of course, it's only ours to address. Humility helps us to accept that the Son and not us is at the center of the universe and that we can do, often, just a little, and pay attention just a little bit, and that still matters. Hubris finds us giving advice to total strangers on the streets or in the grocery stores or, on our way to work on BART. It finds us even more dangerously giving advice to our children and our parents and our siblings and their children and their parents and on and on. Humility makes us better listeners just all the way around. Hubris makes being right more important than being in relationship. Humility can allow us to have more hope and more joy, more times of just being and living and just loving. Hubris leaves us exhausted and brittle and disappointed in all of those who didn't listen to our advice or follow our way. Humility makes us more resilient because our participation, while it's important, it isn't all up to us. Humility recognizes our interconnection. Hubris says, all of this must be done by me. You can always get it right next time, right? Now, there is a point. Every week when I am composing a sermon, when I get into this sort of zone of sermonizing, and in that point, my focus sort of becomes whatever the topic is. So, like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you know how that is. So as I was marching yesterday with our wonderful, spirited delegation from the congregation, only a portion of the many people who were in the march, I was sort of in that zone where I was reflecting on humility and then watching the events of the march around me through that lens. And it was really interesting because I was thinking about how much hubris we had last year. We really thought, I think, that many of us taking to the streets would just turn everything around and then it would all be done, things we didn't like. We're not devoid of hubris this year, but I think it's different. And if we were to approach the issue really through a more, lens of humility, I think we might see different kinds of signs, perhaps. We might have seen fewer that used expletives to describe our opponents. We might have seen more calling for the eradication of those conditions, especially extreme economic insecurity and empowered racial bias that have allowed people to rise to power that probably don't reflect the will of the majority in our nation. And it's worth thinking about this link between humility and resilience, because what we know now that we didn't know last year is this, that what we're resisting now, we've been resisting for a very long time, and we will be resisting it for a very long time to come. So Andrew Zolli has come up with a new idea called resilience thinking, which scientists and governments and social innovators are all finding very helpful. He says that resilience asks us to how we support people and create systems that know how to recover and persist and even thrive in the face of change, even change we don't want. He says that the belief that every problem is solvable and solvable by us makes us less resilient. He says this: we mastered the atom, we invented the contemporary information society, we electrified the planet, and against that backdrop, you can kind of forgive human beings for thinking they were in control and that they had mastery. But believing that we do is its own form of madness. Changes in climate, economy, and geopolitics means we have to meet these new trends with some new tools, and some of those tools might be the old tools that we rejected long ago, including humility. Zolli thinks so. He says, I think what's happened is that there's a new shift to humility. We saw this after the financial crisis in 2008. Over the course of several years, he says, you could see the language start to shift, and people start to say, my goodness, there's no way we can steer around all these storms. We had better build a better boat. If humility is part of resilience, we might want to help ourselves and start developing a taste for that humble pie. For me, the only thing more beautiful than the stars at night, and I walk most nights so that I can see them, is the morning stars. Though sometimes I wish I don't see them quite as often as I do. But I try to seek out the stars because there's something about the fact that they aren't really seeable by me that is really a wonderful form of humility. They speak of a distance, of a perspective, of an infinity that I can't know. They make me feel small and insignificant in a good way. From their vantage point, my problems are small like me, and something as small as me can't possibly be responsible for everything. Not a te torbe. You are held by something larger. I think the poet Marge Piercy captures that when she says, "It is not I who speaks, but the wind. Wind blows through me, and long after me is the wind." The longer I live, the less I know. Someone said that to me when I was a cub reporter long ago, back in the day, and I thought, yeah, well, I won't tell you what I thought because it really lacks humility. But I will tell you that I hear that statement very differently now, and in fact, I just said it to someone not very long ago. And I said it with a deep joy and relief, because humility, it seems to me, is its own kind of intelligence. We are living in a time in which much is changing, and we are not going to know all the answers, and humility could be one of our walking companions. It's cold out there, and we need to pick up that poor, wet baby and hold her close. We need to remember that for each of us to let our own light shine, we have to understand that we're part of a greater force for good that comes from that font of every blessing that some would say God, some would call nature, and some would just call the more. To truly honor the other, I must be able to receive their truths with openness, to be humbled before this world and the great, great beauty that it offers us every day, as well as the great terrors that it sometimes offers. I must know and depend on the great guide star of love. May we, through our actions, through our words and through our deeds, be truly the ones to make it so.